Welcome. I'm Angelica.
And I'm Gaia. Today we're speaking to Ed, a serial entrepreneur that exited his first medical cannabis company for $400 million in 2021 and is now the co-founder of food tech company Clean Food Group. Hi, Ed.
Hi.
Thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
So what is Clean Food Group?
So Clean Food Group is essentially an ingredients company, but we don't create our ingredients in a typical agriculture sense. We create them in a laboratory or manufacturing facility environment. So it's what's known as cell agriculture. And we utilize a cell which helps us produce sustainable food oils. Now, food oils are essentially around about 30% of the fats and calories that we consume on a daily basis. Not only that, these items are also in cosmetics and numerous other things. So it's something that, probably before we go to work every morning or, drop the kids at school or whatever, we've already consumed or utilized 5 or 10 products that have these oils and fats in them.
Is the company mainly a B2B enterprise?
At the moment, we're still in the sort of scale-up phase, I think is the best way to put it. So we're at industrial scale at this point, but we're not at a point where we're selling the product as yet, but we're not too far away from that. There's lots of regulatory hurdles because obviously this is something that we want to get into the human food supply chain, animals as well. But in terms of skincare and cosmetics, for example, that will happen fairly soon. And we're already working with a number of very big players, both on the food side and, of course, on the cosmetic side.
How did you come into this industry? Because it seems quite niche.
It is relatively niche, but I think if we already referred to my history of starting a medical cannabis company, and we were Europe's biggest medical cannabis company, and it essentially still is, but under a new ownership. When you look at cannabis or cannabinoids, they're ingredients effectively. So, and they're utilized in lots of different things. You obviously have the plant itself, which is full of various different cannabinoids. But if you recall, CBD was a very big thing for a long time. There are lots of other cannabinoids such as CBG, CBH, all these things that were utilized in drinks and other foods and, again, cosmetics as well. So it's an area that we understand really well in terms of ingredients. What we really liked about the cell agriculture space is we have an enormous amount of problems in terms of supply chain. We've got wars breaking out. When the Ukraine-Russia situation broke out, it took nearly a third of the world's supply chain offline. And you may or may not recall, depends, I'm not much of a cook myself, but I remember it being quite a big thing in the news. Your rapeseed oil, sunflower oil,
Kale.
It was all a nightmare. Everyone was going, we can't get this stuff. And there's a lot of other products, obviously, that were affected by this. But we knew that as time goes on, we can't just keep, for example, in the case of palm oil, which is something that our product does a very good job of being a bioequivalent replacement for. You can't just keep cutting down rainforests at the alarming rate that we do, because eventually it's just completely unsustainable. Also, from companies' perspective, there's lots of food manufacturers out there, and they have a margin chain within which they have to work. These products were going up and down, hugely volatile to buy your kilo of palm oil, litre of palm oil. And these companies are buying it in the metric ton. So you can imagine if something's going from $4 a kilo to $12 a kilo in the space of a year, these companies, it's very hard for them to manage their pricing. So what we also realized is by creating it in a manufacturing facility, we're going to be able to fix that price for a much longer period of time. Obviously, scale is the critical thing. But yeah, sorry if I'm rabbiting on, but essentially, what we're trying to do is solve a problem that is both from a sustainability perspective, but also, pricing, because that is a really big problem.
So where are these facilities?
So at the moment, we use a technique which is very well understood, which is called precision fermentation. So obviously huge amounts of breweries all around the world, and it's a step up, if you like, from that. There's some retrofitting required, but thankfully our technology allows us to essentially retrofit already built facilities, which is, again, another, you're almost utilizing something that may be a bit defunct now. There's lots of breweries around the world. Some are being utilized massively, some are not. So we're also able to go in and restore effectively some of these manufacturing facilities and do a lot of scale.
How regulated is the industry, and how are you using your past experience in a heavily regulated industry to navigate the situation? Because I would imagine that it's a very nascent industry.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, it's a brilliant question, and one of the things that happened with CBD, particularly in the cannabinoid industry, was you had to do something called a novel food approval, because essentially, although humans had been consuming hemp, for example, and hemp derivatives, this was seen as a new product, a bit like flaxseed oil. That had to go through the same process, which is essentially you go through a regulated body, you do lots of toxicity studies, and you basically prove that this product is safe for human consumption, and that it's sustainably safe. So, at various different levels, and that's essentially how we get it into the human food supply chain. So a lot of companies in the cannabinoid sector really struggled with that. Without wishing to sound boastful, we nailed it pretty quickly, and we were able to transfer that knowledge and that experience into this new product, and again go down that same path of doing novel food. In the US, there's a slightly different, so it varies by territory, but again, it's something we've got a lot of experience in, and that is another reason we were drawn to this particularly. A lot of people are trying to create lab-grown chicken and lab-grown meat that you've probably heard quite a lot about. We think that's a real thing, and it's definitely something that has to be addressed and dealt with over the years. But I think what we like about ingredients is it's not the whole plate. The biggest piece of your plate is that meat, that chicken, that fish. Trying to get people to change their behavior, it's a very, very difficult thing to do. If you go to the restaurant and they say, "Oh, would you like this? You can have the lovely grass-fed, organic,
or the lab-grown meat,
or you can have the lab-grown meat." It's quite a difficult thing to get people to transition to, and again, cost of bringing what is a structured product, because at that point you've got to get it to look nice. It's got to have the fat striation through it. That's really complicated and very, very expensive. What we like about the ingredients thing is if you care about the environment, sustainable products, etc., you're going, oh, fantastic. I'm buying something, I'm buying it at the same price that I would have paid for the non-sustainable product. And if that's not something that's massively on your mind, you're just going, oh, it tastes the same, great, no problem. I know it's healthy, I know it's gone. They're not even looking effectively. So you're not asking people to change their behavior, but if people do want to change their behavior and eat in a more or consume in a more sustainable way, they can do that. So
I have so many questions. With the taste, do you have to go through a really rigorous process in order to make it taste good?
The interesting thing about a lot of the fats and oils is a lot of it is really about texturing. So it's actually, a lot of these products are quite tasteless. That's not where the taste is derived. So it's, I don't know if you've ever gone to a shop and bought the sort of organic peanut butter or something similar to that, and you it literally pours out. It's horrible and runny. That's because it doesn't have, for example, palm oil or cocoa butter in it, which is the sort of binding and thickening agent. So again, humans, we're so used to a product that we like because it tastes good, it feels good, the texture's right. I think if you go and get something and it's materially different to that, it is a bit of an adjustment. And again, a slight change of behavior. So it's not, I think I'm probably rabbiting on again, but it is more about the texture and how the product looks and feels rather than how it tastes.
So I'm just wondering, because I'm thinking that I would imagine that partnerships with other food companies or cosmetic companies are going to be a very important part of your process when you actually go to market. So I'm just wondering what partnerships you're already working on now and what key industries you see benefiting from this.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's one of those things. If you sort of go back 2, 3, 4, 5 times removed, it significantly benefits lots of different people within the supply chain, and of course consumers themselves. But in terms, the great thing is a lot of the manufacturers, a lot of the retailers, they are all, not because they're necessarily being forced to, but they're all moving towards this. Particularly in Europe, they care about sustainability. You know, a lot of these big brands, whether that's the retailers like your Boots of this world, whether it's, I don't know, Waitrose, your grocers, they care, and they want these products, not only because they will need to be able to, again, get the margins right, because if you're a producer, you're making your product for, let's say, £1, you're selling it to the supermarket for £2, and the supermarket's putting probably the best part of 100% margin on it, depending on what the specific product is. So you have to be able to fit your product into that margin chain. And if you can get that right, still provide something that's sustainable, that tastes, looks and feels good, then you're winning. So all the big players in food, your Mondelez of this world, you know, we have very, very strong relationship with them. We do a lot of work with them already. You know, what we're doing is being embraced massively by, I would say, everybody in that space. There isn't really anybody, but that's turning around going, oh, we don't want to, you know, as soon as we start talking about it and we start going anywhere near a discussion around solid fats, for example, which is cocoa butter of this world, and that's typically a saturation fat level of like 60%. And that means at room temperature, it's like a solid fat. But it, you know, if you warm it up, it will start to become a viscous liquid. And yeah, we're very, very lucky, and we've got brilliant people in the company. You know, I'm not a technical science guy, so this would not be at all possible without our co-founder and lead on the science, Chris Chuck. I mean, he's a genius, and essentially he spent the last decade building this technology, and this technology is effectively an organism. Of course, he would speak far better to this than I ever could, so I won't do it the injustice of trying to explain anything on a sort of in his words, because I will only get it wrong. But that's the great thing, you know, whenever you try and build a business around something, and what we've done here is we've built a business around something real. We haven't built a business to go and explore and find out about something. This already existed, and all we've done is effectively corporatize it and make sure that it has the capital that it needs to get to the point where it can actually, you know, we can all enjoy these products in a safe and sustainable way. So it's really cool. And yeah, some of the big names I never thought I'd necessarily be dealing with, but we are. So
how did you get the capital? What was that process?
My belief, and this is sort of controversial, is that you know, there's huge pools of capital out there. You've got your typical friends and family route. You've got small institutions. You've got, you know, your angels, family offices, and then all the way up into your big institutions. And I genuinely believe if you've got a credible team, a credible product or service, whatever it is that you might be trying to do, or a piece of tech, for example, it's not difficult to raise money. It really isn't. And I think people overcomplicate it a lot, but I also think people get it wrong, because often it's sort of like, well, I've got the fork, but I'm going to try and make it ever so slightly better. What's the proposition to a consumer? I'm going to spend 10 quid on this new fork that does something, you know, a little bit better, but not enough to make me move away from. So I see it a lot. I've worked in venture capital and PE for a long time as well, and I still actually indeed run a small VC fund which is actually listed, And, we see an enormous amount of investment propositions, and quite honestly, 99% of them are very nicely put together, not necessarily bad people or not smart. You've got really smart people, but they've sort of got obsessed about the idea rather than the functionality and the reality of what people are willing to do. So
what do you think are the pieces that make a credible product?
Well, that's very important. There has to be a need for it. The best products and the people who have gone on to create something that we all know as like a household name, for example, are things that really solve a problem that we all experience every day, that make our lives easier, that make something that was dysfunctional more functional. So that's always a good place to start. But again, there's a bit of a blurred line where people go, oh, well, this makes it a little bit easier. It has to be transformational, and it has to be at a price proposition that makes sense. So if you come along and you're charging 3 times more for something that kind of already works, it's just not going to work. If you can come along with something that makes your life better and it's cheaper, or feels almost free because it seamlessly fits into your life. And obviously with tech, having phones and stuff, if you've got something that all you've got to do is press a button and download something that makes your life easier, that's a huge win, as we all know.
Based on your experience with the VC firm as well, are there any industries or any problems in particular that you think people aren't addressing in the right way, or that are over addressed, I would guess?
Yeah, I think, when I look at certain categories in, when you go to a supermarket, for example, and you see all these products and there's 24 brands all doing pretty much the same thing. I admire anybody that steps into that space. I really do. And I've listened to some of your and watched some of your podcasts, and there are people that have done that successfully. And I am full of admiration because I would not have the kahunas to go and do that. I just think building a brand is extremely difficult. So what I think a lot of people go down the route of, we must build a brand. And it's a dangerous game to go down, in my opinion.
Interesting. The reason we look at each other is because we've had so many discussions about how brand can be the thing that pulls a consumer in over the product, for the exact reason that you just said. When you go into Boots, when you go into a supermarket and you see the same thing just repackaged, but why'd you go for that? Or if you look in the athleisure wear section, for instance, you look at a brand like Lululemon and then Aloe, they're the same thing. They're literally the same thing. But what brings you to it? It's because of the feeling. It's because of the brand.
I think there's a culture around it, and it may be that, somebody that you admire or are a fan of, for example, maybe they've done really good product placement and they put it in the hands of somebody that has a gravitas, and people want to, they like that person. They think, oh, they like it.
The influence aspect.
Yeah, it's unconscious bias. Effectively, you don't realize you're doing it, but you're kind of somebody that you like seeing it, and you kind of go, oh well, I'm walking past Lululemon. I'm the worst guy where it comes to fashion. I have no fashion sense. I buy, when I buy my jeans, I buy the same pair of jeans 3 times over, so that I've always, because these are things that are consumable effectively, and I buy the same T-shirt in either basically dark blue or white, and that's not because it's just because I'm unimaginative, unfortunately. I mean, this is like as trendy as I've got in a long time, if it's even trendy. But it really amazes me when people go in to do brand, because it's something I understand, but I just wouldn't know where to start. And that to me is maybe I'm a bit of a baby, or I'm a scaredy cat, but I'm always full of admiration for people that make brand work.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that is worth mentioning, and that's one thing that every single one of these founders that we've interviewed that have brands that really strongly hinge on the branding aspect, is they mention that the barrier to entry is low. And so I think that for a lot of founders, what discourages them initially is that if they want to enter a capital-intensive industry, they get scared off, or they feel like the risk is too high. Well, obviously the risk still exists if you're opening a food and bev brand, but it's slightly different. So what would you say to founders that shy away from the capital-intensive industries?
I'd say, look, if you can do something, in a low capex way, fantastic. I wish to God many times that I was in business. When I go back to when I was a kid, and there used to be this big pick your own, where people go and pick their own strawberries and raspberries and stuff, that was next to us. And I went and said to them, I can't remember how old I was, 10 years old or something, and said, can I do a cafe here? You get lots of people coming here, but there's no drinks or anything. It was just a shed where you go and weigh your stuff. And I just thought it'd be great. And so, I think I borrowed 30 quid off my dad or something, who kindly, was egging me on a bit.
Believed in the vision.
Yeah, but it was great. I remember, and then I got my little brother involved, and before we were making 120 quid a day as like 10-year-olds. It was fantastic.
That's a fortune.
It's a few decades more than I'd like ago as well. So I think if you can do stuff off the bat like that, it's very, very rewarding, and you get quite instant gratification. And you also know whether or not what you're doing is right. When you're building something, there's a huge amount of risk in doing that. But it's very much about making sure that you've got the right capital partners with you, or you've either got incredibly deep pockets. Now, most entrepreneurs, when they start out, don't have deep pockets. And, as we were just talking a bit in the sort of preamble, it's quite a miserable affair at times, because you are, no one's paying you a salary. You've got to try and, if you're lucky enough to raise money and people, sensible capital goes, well, you've got to pay yourself something. We don't want you to be miserable and like not being able to eat, because that's going to create stress that will impact our investment effectively. So, and that I do see that sometimes with investors. I'm like, why do you want them suffering? Like that's not helpful. You need them getting up every day, knowing that like the basics are covered, and that they can actually get on with doing a good job. So, but that's another discussion for another time, I suspect. But I think, raising money is not something to be scared of if it's for the right reasons. And, if people will give you value for what you've built, and people are not just backing the specific thing that you're doing, they're backing you. That's such a big part of it. I mean, it's hard to sort of put a percentage behind it, for example, but it is a huge part of it. If you get somebody come in, and I've had it many times where people come in and they've got a really brilliant idea, concept or product or service that they want to offer, but they're not perhaps the right person to deliver the pitch. So
what skills are you looking for, and what qualities are a turn off?
I think I think it's natural that when somebody comes in, you want to see sort of some passion. So if somebody comes in and they're quite sort of, it's not very exciting, it's quite flat. Yeah. It's kind of hard to get excited about that conversation, even if the underlying is quite interesting. Now, don't get me wrong, I've met some very special people who perhaps maybe a little bit on the spectrum of autism, for example. And that's an amazing discussion, because if you're trying to put yourself in a position, thinking in a way that is just alien to you, but it's totally normal to them, but yet what they're saying is just like, wow, that's genius. No one without that situation could have thought of something such an amazing way to deal with a problem. So you have to give people a chance, but at the same time, I think it's really important for people to kind of get their pitch down and make sure that they come across themselves as authentic. So I think authenticity is the important thing. And being able to actually not just be the salesman that can kind of deliver the pitch. Can they answer some of the sort of slightly difficult questions, and do they fall to pieces or get very, very defensive? I've had that many times. I had it actually just the other week, something I was really, really interested in. And I said to the guy, I said, look, you are really brilliant at what you do. You're the perfect chief operating officer type figure, but you want to be the CEO. I don't know why, because being the CEO is horrible. Yes, it may have some plaudits when everything goes right, but actually the COO is probably one of the most important parts, as is the CFO. And, if it's your small business, the guy that runs the money is really important, but the guy or the girl that's actually pushing the business forward, doing the ops, that's the really critical bit. And the guy just didn't want to listen to the fact that I was like, look, I'm just giving you've asked me. You've asked me for what I think. I'm being so honest with you, not in a rude way, but I said, I think if you had somebody that was out there doing the more sort of pitching this and being the kind of the
spokesperson.
Then, and you're focusing on actually running the business, you know, in the minutiae, I think you're going to be really successful. You just didn't want to hear it and was getting really defensive at the same time as going, please give me your feedback. And I'm like,
do you think, go ahead. I know what you're going to ask.
No, I want to know, do you, if you're able to talk about it, do you have an example of somebody who's come in with an insane idea, they're the exact character that you want to see, and they've got an amazing product and have executed it?
Yeah.
What does that look like?
So there's been numerous times where I've really wanted to invest in something, but the problem is they know they're really good and they know that they have a really good business, and the value proposition is probably a little bit too late for me as an individual to be investing in it.
Right.
Because I'm sort of like, well, God, if I, you know, for argument's sake, someone I met had a really interesting tech platform that was dealing with a lot of regulatory stuff, and I liked it a lot. I didn't like it at the number that they were sort of suggesting, but they knew they were going to be able to raise it. They wanted to work with me, I wanted to work with them, but it was just a little bit too late, because I would have liked to be investing at, you know, a fifth of the value of where they were. And they eventually got their raise away and they're going really, really well. But so, you know, and I'm a massive champion of them, but at the same time I'm annoyed because
wish you got there earlier.
and that's a sort of risk reward thing. It's, you know, if someone comes along and you really think their business is valued now at a couple of million, they want to get a 20 million valuation, and that's the important thing as well. When you are going to raise money, you have to be realistic about it. You have to be defensive of where you're at, but you also have to think about, well, hold on, what does this capital bring anything else to the table? Is it, you know, if it's the kind of capital that's bringing a load of useful advice, stewardship, everything else, then there's a lot more value to that money than there is from your, you know, friends and family on a sort of EIS type basis. They're not necessarily going to bring anything to the table. They're kind of just going to be passive investors. But somebody that's going, well, I'm obviously not going to pay the same as those guys who are sort of passive investors. I'm going to be hugely involved in helping, and so the valuation is a different proposition for those two investors, is the way I look at it, and that's something that people struggle to get their head around.
And typically for you, what industries are the ones you're investing in?
Me personally, I've typically, like a lot of people who've sort of had some wins, had lots of losses as well along the way. I just like backing things that I'm involved in, and also quite often if I'm investing in something, I'll have friends, you know, or people that have invested in stuff that I've been involved in that I might say, I think you'd really like this. So I'm bringing them along as well. And in doing so, I feel a level of responsibility. So I want to be involved in not just as a sort of, oh yeah, give me a call once in a while, like actively speaking every week. And that's what I'm used to. You know, I'm not a typical entrepreneur in terms of I've just, you know, built something from the ground up with no help. I've always worked with other people, partly because I recognize that I'm really good at a few things and I'm really terrible at a bunch of things.
What are the things you're bad at?
I mean, if you said to me, right, sit down, do this spreadsheet, and you know, these guys I've got a guy that I work with who is he's the smartest young guy ever. When he first came and worked with us, and I said, why in God's name do you want to work with us? You know, you've got an incredible CV. You should go off and work with Goldman Sachs, or, you know, and I'll introduce you, by the way. He was like, nope, I really like what you guys do. I really want to do it. And I was like, oh, that's great. When can you start? Anyway, he's become a business partner because he's way smarter than me. He's younger, he's hungrier. He's just going to be an absolute rock star. And, you know, I would be like, oh God, I'm trying to do the spreadsheet, and, you know, and he would literally do it in 10 minutes. It would take me 2 days, I'm telling you. So it's just a total waste of my time when people are good at it. My job is to make myself redundant as quickly as possible, basically.
That's interesting, because we had a guest last week who said the same exact thing.
Same thing.
Yeah.
And I guess the narrative there is that some founders, and we've spoken about this with a lot of other founders on the podcast, some founders say that it's important to learn to separate yourself from the business. But what the founder we had on last week said is that he thinks that that's absolutely impossible. And if you don't have that sense of self associated to it, then you don't have the grit and you don't push hard enough.
You don't have that skin in the game. You're not going to be pushing for it.
Yeah, I would say most of the businesses that I'm involved in have either a partner, at least one, or we have investors, because we've got to a point where the business is at big numbers, shall we say, or certainly bigger numbers than I'm capable of dealing with personally. And yeah, the team is everything, and if you don't, and it's interesting, I've worked with, so Clean Food Group, for example, our CEO, our CFO, our head of comms, all were heavily involved from very, very early on in my previous cannabis business, medical cannabis business, EMAC Life Sciences. And they were massively important in that whole process. And gradually, as we've left that company at different times, but yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a better team out there in what we do, quite frankly. And I don't say that rudely. I just genuinely believe, and I also believe that when we go in and we meet venture capital firms, when we meet trade players, whether it's grocers, whether it's food manufacturers, I think they recognise that very quickly. So I think having the right team, it's a very difficult thing to do, but when you have it, you know it.
How do you maintain those core values and that core strategy that helps you grow when you scale globally?
I think it's very difficult. I mean, these things happen, right? Once you're on the path, they sort of happen, whether you kind of like it or not. So some of it's from inbound, some of it's from you reaching out to other people. It comes from random conversations. It comes from people that you're meeting who are looking at it from an investment perspective. These things just happen, and you just roll with it. That's all you can do. And in the earliest days, you're the guy that's driving the bus. You're also changing the wheel when you get a flat tire, and you're collecting the tickets as people get on. So you kind of have to be prepared to do everything. I mean, looking back to the medical cannabis business, I spent 30% of my time roughly just literally on the banking app, paying invoices and people. And it was just well, yeah, I mean, yeah, but again, this is the other thing is like entrepreneurialism so glorified. I think wrongly so, quite honestly. There's some of the people I know who are just, I wish I had the skills and the ability that they have. They don't want entrepreneurialism in their life. They like working around it, for example, but they like having the security of a job. They want to, be able to go home at night and not think about work particularly, and get on them. There's no there's no shame whatsoever in that. And in fact, some of the most successful people I know are, it's pretty. I wouldn't want to look back on my life and be like, oh God, I've been married 5 times, which means at least 4 divorces. That's not a good way. And I see it a lot more with entrepreneurs than I see it with people that have. They have purpose in their life, but it's not everything
how much
to
it
them.
Impacts your personal life. And
I think the key thing that really draws people is working for yourself and having that liberty to be your own boss. What would you say is misleading about that?
I'd say there's a huge amount of the idea. I don't think when people go, oh, I'm my own boss, you're not. You still have customers, you still have clients or consumers or whatever it is. You're always working for somebody, whether you like it or not, right? I think there's a false narrative and a false sense of security in assuming that you are working for yourself. And none of us really know what's going to happen next month, next year. We're all just headlong into the things that we're doing. We know that we're doing a good job. When you build a stable business that you think, okay, this is like an annuity now. It's how much do I want to grow? I know lots of guys and girls who have amazing businesses that they're pretty happy with where they're at. Yeah, they want to grow just a little bit every year to sort of protect themselves from, a customer or something, maybe not being a customer anymore. But they don't want to build $1 billion business. And I totally understand that. The great thing about business is anyone can do it. Not everyone, though, is kind of built for it, if that makes sense.
The resilience,
anyone can do it, but it's like, do you want to do it? And at times it's a roller coaster. So many times over the years I've spoken with people I deeply respect who have, made fortunes, lost fortunes, made fortunes all over again. And the one thing they always say, and I'll summarize it because it's the same roundabout thing that they're saying, it's better to travel than arrive. And by that, what I mean is, for example, when we sold EMAC previously and some of the other businesses which were a bit smaller that I've sold, it's been both an amazing sense of relief in a way, but at the same time followed very quickly by absolute misery and a feeling of being totally lost and having no purpose. Because
like
even
the
though
Olympian who wins the gold medal, it's like,
absolutely, yeah,
you've reached it.
Yeah, it's nuts, and that's the problem. That's why we keep going again. Is because we're sort of chasing that feeling.
Yeah,
and that feeling is often the best bits of building any business. I think are that first few years where it's just all encompassing, and you're building, and there's more and more people arriving, but everyone, you get to know them really, really well, and you're all on this journey together, and it's fantastic. Once you get to the point where we've got 300 employees now, it becomes a very, very different proposition, and a very, it doesn't mean that you're not enjoying it, but it doesn't have that same
the challenge, the grit,
and those sort of sleepless nights where you're like, oh my god,
like the adrenaline junkie aspect of it almost.
It is really, and I think some people, I'm generally happier where if you think about a tachometer, I'm better when I'm sort of revving at like 5,000-6,000 RPM. Some people just don't like that. When I'm too low, I start, that's when I get in my own head and I start questioning things, and then you start getting into all kinds of weird and wonderful or not so wonderful places of, fantasies. God, am I, imposter syndrome, all these kind of things. Like, am I just a lucky idiot? And don't get me wrong, I'd rather be lucky than good. But and that's another thing as well about business in general. Everyone, and I reckon I know, so lucky to know some incredibly successful people, a lot very well-known household names. And one thing that's true of all of them is that we've all had the times, and I speak to a lot because I'm not interested in the big glory event. That's well documented. What I'm interested in is like, what were the worst times? Because that's the bit that I can sort of go, oh my God, yeah.
What were your worst times?
Oh, waking up at like 3 o'clock in the morning going, Jesus, our monthly burn is £1 million a month. And we've got literally 3 months of cash left. So we need to raise money. Like, and we're in the process of it, but like bad things are going on in the world. And
would you wake up with the racing heart?
Yeah. And I mean, yes, definitely. I mean, I'm sort of probably I'm naturally a bit prone to anxiousness. Thankfully, I'm very high functioning with it, but it's definitely a part of me.
That's so counterintuitive, because you would think that steady nerves, but I guess that also triggers the adrenaline. The interesting thing with anxiety
is that it makes you think about every aspect. It gives you a very lateral view of everything. That's
a brilliant way to say it. So one thing, I remember having this conversation with someone. I came across a really nasty car accident and pulled over and just got stuck in straight away. Whereas other people in my car who were real cool, calm, they were sort of losing their minds a bit. And it's entirely due to my anxious disposition that I was able to do that. Afterwards, I was like, oh my God, what just happened? That was nuts. But so it definitely, it almost allows things to kind of slow down at times, which is, again, totally counterintuitive. But we're all built differently, and we're all driven by different things. At the end of the day, one thing I do know is none of us are going to sit there on our deathbed and go like, oh, I wish I'd made another million. That's still going to be the last thing on your mind at that point. You're going to be thinking, did I have great experiences? And that's the important thing about life. And that, for me, is also the important thing about business. At the end of the day, when the money drops in the bank, it's like, oh God, well, I've got to go and do something else now. I've got to protect this, or I've got to grow it, or I've got to, it becomes another. But when you're in the moment and you're building towards something, and you're all, you don't know. There's always that everyone's sort of thinking, in the back of their mind, like this could fail. Anything could fail. Big banks, your job that gives you 1 month, 2 months, 3 months notice, that can fail, right? So there's nothing secure in life, and that's part of the beauty of it. And often those endings are the bit that forces you to go and do something else, and it's really exciting. It's scary, but it's exciting, and that's when you really find out what you're actually interested in as well. So I just think, building businesses is you either love it or you don't. And, I love it. And that's what I talk about with my friends. Yeah. We sit and we talk about what we're doing, what we want to do, opportunities, what we see happening in the world. And that's what often, some of those conversations are what makes you go, yeah, definitely. And also reaffirms what you're doing. When I sit down and talk to people and, you've had a rough week because, I don't know, a fermentation batch has not been as successful as you hoped. And you're kind of like, oh God, the last one was fantastic and the one before that was fantastic, and anyway, you figure out what was wrong and you realize it was sort of human error involved rather than there's actually an issue with your technology. But you sit down and you're catching up with someone, you talk about business that maybe you're both invested in, and they ask you, oh, how's it going there? And they're going, mate, what you're doing, trust me, that is, and that's quite nice. It's
good.
Yeah, and I suspect these people who are building brands, from nothing, that for them, when people are going, I'm not kidding, like I've tried your product, it's amazing.
Yeah.
And that must be like that.
So can I ask?
Go.
I'm dying to ask. With going back to what you were saying earlier with being an entrepreneur and having all these different ideas and also being slightly anxiety prone, in the early days, how did you find the line between what was almost fantasy and what was tangible?
Yeah, that's exactly what I want to ask.
Really interesting. I think there's definitely a bit of manifestation, whether I'm using that word because that's what people call it. I've never thought about it like that, but there is definitely a kind of visual element where you're in your mind, you're imagining certain scenarios. Now, I played very high level sport when I left school. I played rugby, and that I thought was going to be my career. I got injured after a couple of years, but also in the back of my mind, I always used to have this sort of almost idea of like Gordon Gekko from Wall Street. I weirdly was drawn to characters like that who were sort of ruthless, but I'm not that kind of person. I think I'd be a lot richer if I was. But that's not, again, what it's about. But I definitely think there is a visual element to it. And again, going back to the rugby, I used to imagine, I'd run the game in my head, and there would be moments in the game where it's like, oh my God, this is unfolding exactly how I imagined.
It's unbelievable.
And you literally step, you're in for a try, and you're like, I literally visualized that before it happened. And I know a lot of top athletes do that, for example. Why don't we do that in business? And I think people do, they just don't realize they're doing it. But yeah, when you talk about the tangible side of it, you know what you have, but you have to have great imagination when it's, the can of water, right? You're like, it's just a can, it's just a bit of tin or aluminium or whatever it is. Like, how's it going to become a really successful brand that you're picking up all around the world? You have to have a lot of belief and a lot of imagination for that to become a reality.
In the very, very early days, though, what was that thing that pushed you forward?
I think it was understanding that, we know what we know there's a huge gap in the market, or we know that it's not being served at all. But also, of course, you don't always know what other people are doing. So you kind of go on this journey and gradually you meet people and you're like, okay, there are other people looking at it. But the other thing is we try not to compare ourselves with what other people are doing. We know there's an opportunity there. What are we good at? Okay, we're good at that. That's the direction we're going to go, and we're going to not deviate from that. We'll pivot only if it's really, really necessary and it's as a result of a regulatory change or any sort of legal change in another country, or, for example, the guys who were making lab-grown meat, Italy turned around and said, we're not going to allow it. So that was a big blow for those companies. And whether or not it's, it becomes the reality, who knows? But, you have to then still go, okay, well, that's fine. We've still got the rest of the world to serve.
But where do you toe the line? Because if the consumers aren't ready yet, how do you know when you're at that cusp where they're at a point where they can eventually be converted? It's a great
question. The answer is I don't really know. What I know is that I always try and mitigate that, and that's why we went down the ingredients route instead of that, because I didn't want to have that problem. I didn't want to be the person who's re-educating the world on something. I wanted to be the person who's effectively, and this, I don't know how to say it without it sounding slightly wrong in a way, but I want to be able to, like, the ingredient goes in the product and you either care or you don't. It's the same thing, right? That's not disingenuous. That's just, this is it's a completely non-genetically modified product. So it's not like you're getting a GM product instead of a natural product. It's still a natural product because we use a non-genetically modified organism.
And as a consumer, you're like, this is something I can do just a little bit better. So
yeah, I mean, I think it depends. Yeah, as a consumer, I think we all want to try and do. One thing. I love motorsport, for example, which is difficult. At times you're like, is it bad? Is it good? But at the same time, I am so aware, and I see the plastic rubbish all over the place. So I think that's something, for example, that we can all do a lot about. Is it realistic to say, don't go on holiday and have a nice time? You've been working really hard. You shouldn't get on a plane. I think that, there's lines to be drawn, but there's definitely things we can all do better. And I think, for example, what we're doing with Clean Food Group, it serves a number of different functions. One being the environmental and sustainability piece. Another being, well, we know that we can create a healthy product, that exactly what's in it. There's no pesticides. There's nothing nasty to get in there. We'll have full toxicity studies. You don't get that when you go and buy an organic product, for example, that's been grown in the field. So there's a lot of things we can all do better. But ultimately, in the cold, hard light of day, things have to make sense. You have to be able to make a profit, because if you can't make a profit, there's no good in being sustainable if you can't make a profit, right? It was the same when we were dealing with cannabinoids. If you can't sell, give patients what they really need without making some money on it, you're not going to be able to do it for very long. So it's not in their interest and it's not in your interest, but it's finding that happy medium where you can flourish as a business, but the consumer's always getting a better and better product at a nice price proposition, which also helps them know that they're doing something good.
So you need to address a need, not create a need, basically.
Yeah, exactly. I'd always rather be in a position of addressing something, solving a problem, rather than trying to create a demand for something totally new. Re-education is, it's such a difficult thing to do. It's time consuming. It costs enormous amounts of money, and it doesn't always work. And I admire, again, I'm not saying don't go and do that, because at the end of the day, if you genuinely 100% believe in what you're doing, you're passionate about it, you are committed to doing it, then you should do it. No one should tell you, don't give it a go. Building businesses, you're going to have failures. Even within a business that ultimately is successful, you're going to have multiple failures. It's about getting on with it, redressing it, dusting yourself off and getting on with it. There's so much of what life in general is about. We have relationships, they go well, they go badly, and eventually it kind of works out. But you can't do that without repeated failure. And it's a bit cliche to say that, but it's true. And a lot of times we don't even realize that we're failing on a daily basis. It might be like, how do we arrive at a situation where we know, oh, this food doesn't really agree with me? Well, repeated failure, effectively.
Thank you so much.
We could speak for hours. Ed, thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.